My stepfather reported me to ICE for inheritance money. Then he needed a liver donation, and I was his only match. The ICE agents knocked on my apartment door at 6:18 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 3 of them in tactical vests with badges that caught the hallway light. I was holding my coffee mug, still in my pajamas, when the lead agent asked if I was Sofia Reyes. I said yes, and he asked for my documentation. I handed over my green card, the one I'd had since I was 8 years old, the one that made me a legal permanent resident for the past 16 years. He studied it for exactly 11 seconds, then looked at his tablet and said there was a discrepancy in my immigration file that required me to come to their office for processing. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the mug. The agent said I could get dressed, but they'd need to escort me. I asked what discrepancy, what was wrong with my paperwork. He said it would be explained at the federal building downtown. I changed clothes in my bedroom with a female agent watching the doorway, my mind racing through every interaction I'd had with immigration services, every form I'd filled out, every interview I'd attended. I'd done everything right, everything legal. I'd renewed my green card on time. I'd never overstayed. I'd reported every address change. There was no discrepancy. I'd been living in the United States since I was 8 years old, brought here legally by my mother after my biological father died in a car accident in our home country of Colombia. My mother, Anna, had won the visa lottery and used it to build us a new life in California. She'd worked 3 jobs those first years, cleaned houses during the day, waited tables at night, and did bookkeeping on weekends. We lived in a tiny studio apartment in Los Angeles, and I learned English by watching Sesame Street and doing homework with a dictionary next to my textbook. By the time I was 12, I was translating for my mother at parent-teacher conferences and helping her study for her citizenship test. She became a U.S. citizen when I was 14, and I was so proud I cried during the ceremony. I stayed on my green card, planning to apply for citizenship myself once I finished college. My mother met Richard Donovan when I was 15. He was a financial advisor, well-dressed and charming, with graying hair and the kind of confident smile that made people trust him with their money. He seemed genuinely interested in my mother, asked about her work, complimented her English, and told me I was smart when I showed him my report card. They dated for 8 months before getting married in a small ceremony at City Hall. I was happy for my mother. She deserved someone who treated her well after years of struggling alone. Richard moved into our apartment, which suddenly felt crowded with 3 people, but he promised we'd get a bigger place soon. He was making good money, had his own financial planning firm, and within 6 months we moved into a 3-bedroom house in a nicer neighborhood. My mother was thrilled. She had her own walk-in closet and a kitchen with granite countertops and space for all her pots and pans. I got my own bathroom and a bedroom big enough for a desk where I could study. Richard paid for most of it, though my mother contributed what she could from her jobs. He told her she should quit the restaurant work, that she only needed to keep the bookkeeping if she wanted to stay busy. She did, and suddenly she had time to take me shopping or help me with college applications. Life felt stable for the first time. Richard was fine as a stepfather. Not warm exactly, but not cruel. He'd ask about my grades and remind me to do my homework. He attended my high school graduation and took photos with his expensive camera. When I got into UCLA with a partial scholarship, he congratulated me and said education was important. My mother was ecstatic. Her daughter was going to one of the best universities in California. I worked part-time throughout college to cover living expenses, but Richard and my mother helped with the tuition gap. I studied economics, maintained a 3.8 GPA, and graduated with honors at 22. I got a job as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, making decent money for someone just starting out, enough to rent my own apartment and start building my career. Everything changed when I was 23. My biological father's family in Colombia contacted me through Facebook to tell me my paternal grandmother had passed away. She'd left me an inheritance, a piece of property in Medellin that had appreciated significantly in value, along with some savings she'd accumulated over her lifetime. The total was worth approximately $180,000 in US dollars. My grandmother's lawyer in Colombia handled the paperwork, and after taxes and legal fees, I received $162,000. It was transferred to my US bank account in 3 separate deposits over 2 months. I was stunned. I'd met my grandmother only a few times as a small child before we moved to the US, but she'd apparently followed my life through my father's siblings and wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I told my mother immediately, and she cried with happiness, saying it was a blessing from my father's family. I mentioned it to Richard casually over dinner one night, explaining where the money came from. His expression changed when I said the amount. Something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation I didn't understand at the time. He asked detailed questions about the transfer, about Colombian inheritance law, about whether I'd reported it properly to the IRS. I said yes. My CPA had handled everything, all the international transfer documentation, all the tax filings. Richard nodded and said I should be smart with the money, invest it properly, not waste it on frivolous things. I agreed and said I was planning to use it as a down payment on a condo in a few years, once I'd built up my credit more. The question started a week later. Richard called me and asked if I was sure my immigration paperwork was in order. I said yes. Why would he ask that? He said he'd been reading about ICE crackdowns and wanted to make sure everything was documented correctly. I reminded him I'd had my green card since childhood, that it was renewed and valid until 2027. He said green cards could be revoked if there were discrepancies or fraud in the original application. I felt a flutter of anxiety but told him my mother's visa lottery had been legitimate, that we'd gone through every legal channel. He said he was just looking out for me, that he knew I was legal, but sometimes there were issues with documentation from certain countries. I thanked him but felt unsettled by the conversation. Why was he suddenly worried about my immigration status? 2 weeks after that call, Richard asked if I'd considered putting my inheritance into a trust or investment account that he could manage for me. He said he had experience with international assets and could make sure the money was working efficiently. I politely declined, saying I wanted to keep things simple and was working with my own financial advisor. His jaw tightened and he said I was being short-sighted, that family should help family with these things. I reminded him as gently as I could that he was my stepfather, not my biological father, and while I appreciated his advice, I wanted to manage my own finances. The temperature in the room dropped. Richard's face went cold, and he said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret not taking his counsel. My mother tried to smooth things over, saying I was just being independent, that young people like to make their own decisions. Richard didn't speak to me for 3 days after that. The relationship became strained. Richard would make comments at family dinners about how I thought I was too good for his advice now that I had money. He'd say things like, "Must be nice to have a windfall while your mother and I work hard every day." My mother would defend me, saying I worked hard too, that the inheritance was a gift from my grandmother. But I could see the tension it created. I started visiting less frequently, making excuses about work deadlines and social plans. I felt guilty about avoiding them, but Richard's behavior was making me uncomfortable. He'd corner me when my mother was out of the room and ask intrusive questions about my bank balance, my investment strategy, whether I'd bought property yet. I'd give vague answers and change the subject. The final straw came at Thanksgiving dinner when Richard suggested I could help him and my mother buy a second property for rental income. He'd found a condo that needed investors, and he thought I should put $50,000 toward it. I said I wasn't interested in being a landlord and wanted to keep my inheritance for my own future. Richard slammed his hand on the table and said I was selfish, that my mother had sacrificed everything for me, and I couldn't even help her financially. My mother looked shocked and told Richard to calm down. I left before dessert was served, and my mother called me crying an hour later, apologizing for his behavior and saying he was stressed about work. I told her it was okay, but something felt wrong. Really wrong. That was in November. The ICE agents showed up in March, 4 months later. At the federal building, they took me to an interview room and explained that someone had filed a report claiming my original visa application contained fraudulent information, specifically that my mother had lied about my father's death to expedite the process, and that I wasn't actually eligible for derivative status. The allegation was that my father was alive when we applied, and that we'd used false death certificates. I felt my stomach drop. This was insane. My father had died in a car accident in Colombia. I'd been to his funeral. I had memories of my mother crying for months. The agent said they'd need to verify the documentation, and that until they did, my status was in question. I asked who filed the report. They said it was anonymous but appeared credible enough to warrant investigation. Anonymous. The word echoed in my head. I asked how long this would take. They said it could be weeks or months depending on how quickly Colombian authorities could verify the death certificate from 1998. I was released that day but told I couldn't travel internationally and needed to check in weekly. My employer was understanding but concerned, asked if this would affect my ability to work. I said I hoped not. But inside I was panicking. How was this happening? I hired an immigration attorney immediately. A woman named Gloria Chen. Wait, I can't use that name. I hired an immigration attorney immediately. A woman named Margaret Okafor who'd been practicing for 15 years and had excellent reviews. She reviewed my entire immigration file, all the documentation from my childhood, the visa lottery paperwork, the death certificate, everything. She said the documentation looked legitimate, that the death certificate had been properly certified by Colombian authorities and accepted by U.S. immigration at the time. But she said anonymous tips created problems because ICE was obligated to investigate, and in the current political climate, investigations often resulted in detention while paperwork was reviewed. I asked Margaret if she thought someone had filed a false report against me. She said it was possible that false immigration reports were sometimes filed by ex-partners, business rivals, or family members in disputes. The phrase family members made my blood run cold. I called my mother and told her everything. She was horrified, said this had to be a mistake, that our paperwork was legitimate. She still had copies of the death certificate, the funeral expenses, the insurance documents from my father's death. I asked if she'd told anyone about my immigration history recently. She paused. Then she said Richard had been asking questions about it a few weeks ago, wanted to know the exact details of our visa process. She'd thought he was just curious. I felt rage building. I asked her why Richard would suddenly be interested in our immigration history. She said she didn't know, but her voice wavered. I could tell she was starting to suspect the same thing I was. That night, my mother confronted Richard. I wasn't there, but she called me afterward, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said Richard had denied everything at first, but when she threatened to leave him, he'd admitted he'd filed the ICE report. He'd said I'd been disrespectful to him, that I'd refused his financial guidance, that I'd made my mother choose between them. He'd said filing the report was the only way to make me understand I still needed his help, That once I was desperate and facing deportation, I'd have to put my inheritance into his management to prove financial stability to immigration. He'd actually believed he could leverage my immigration status to control my money. My mother moved out that night, packed a bag, and came to my apartment. She was devastated, couldn't believe the man she'd married for 8 years had done something so cruel to her daughter. She filed for divorce the next day. But the damage was done. ICE's investigation was underway, and even though the report was fraudulent, they couldn't just drop it based on family drama. They had to follow protocol, verify documentation, close the loop. Margaret filed a complaint about the false report and requested an expedited review, but she warned me these processes took time. In the meantime, I was in limbo. Couldn't travel, had to check in weekly, had to explain to my employer why I might need time off for immigration appointments. The stress was crushing. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, convinced ICE would show up to detain me. I lost weight. My mother blamed herself, said she should have seen Richard's true character sooner. I told her none of this was her fault, that Richard was a manipulative bastard who'd played everyone. We hired a private investigator to document Richard's admission. The PI, a former police detective named Kevin Wright with 30 years of experience, interviewed my mother and recorded her statement about Richard's confession. He also pulled Richard's financial records, which showed he'd been struggling. His investment firm had lost several major clients, and he was facing potential lawsuits from investors who'd lost money on bad recommendations. He'd been looking for capital, and my $162,000 inheritance must have looked like a solution to his problems. When I wouldn't give him control of it, he'd tried to force my hand by making me desperate enough to need his help. The investigation into my immigration status took 4 months. 4 months of weekly check-ins, of anxiety attacks, of watching my career opportunities evaporate because I couldn't commit to projects that might require travel. 4 months of my mother crying and apologizing even though she'd done nothing wrong. Finally, in July, Colombian authorities confirmed that my father's death certificate was legitimate, that all documentation was in order, and that there was no fraud in our original visa application. ICE closed the investigation and removed the hold on my status. I was cleared. But those 4 months had damaged me. I'd lived in fear of deportation to a country I barely remembered, all because my stepfather wanted to steal my inheritance. Margaret helped me file a formal complaint about the false report, and ICE referred it to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges. Filing a false immigration report was a federal crime, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The U.S. Attorney, a prosecutor named David Lansing who specialized in immigration fraud, reviewed the case and decided to pursue charges. He had my mother's testimony, the PI's investigation, and evidence of Richard's financial motive. The case was strong. Richard was arrested in August and charged with filing a false immigration report and conspiracy to commit fraud. He hired an expensive defense attorney who argued Richard had genuinely believed there might be issues with my documentation, that he'd acted out of concern, not malice. But my mother's testimony destroyed that defense. She told the court exactly what Richard had admitted, that he'd filed the report to control my money. The jury convicted him in 3 hours. Richard was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $75,000 in restitution for my legal fees and damages. He lost his financial planning license, his firm collapsed, and he was left with nothing. My mother finalized the divorce while he was in prison, and she got the house in the settlement since she'd contributed to the down payment, and Richard's assets were seized for restitution. I thought that would be the end of it, that I'd never have to think about Richard again. I was wrong. 2 years after his conviction, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman's voice said she was calling from Los Angeles County General Hospital. She said Richard had been admitted with acute liver failure and needed a transplant urgently. She was a transplant coordinator named Dr. Susan Vega, and she'd been trying to locate Richard's family for potential living donors. She'd found my contact information in his emergency paperwork listed as stepdaughter. I said Richard and I weren't on speaking terms, that he'd gone to prison for filing a false immigration report against me. There was a pause. Dr. Vega said she understood there was family conflict, but Richard was critically ill and without a transplant in the next 6 months, he'd die. She said they were testing all potential family matches, and if I was willing, I could save his life. I laughed. Actually laughed. The man who'd tried to get me deported, who'd tried to steal my inheritance, who'd terrorized me for 4 months, needed my liver. The irony was so sharp it cut. I told Dr. Vega I wasn't interested and hung up. But the call haunted me. Not because I felt guilty. I didn't owe Richard anything. But because it opened old wounds I thought had healed. My mother called me that night. She'd gotten a similar call. She said we should talk about it. I went to her house, the one she'd kept after the divorce, and we sat in her kitchen drinking tea while she told me she'd been thinking. She said she hated Richard for what he'd done, that she'd never forgive him, but that she didn't want to watch someone die if she could prevent it. I asked if she was suggesting I get tested. She said it was my choice, but that she wanted me to have all the information before deciding. She said Richard's doctors had tested his siblings, his cousins, even some extended family, but no one was a compatible match. His blood type was B negative, relatively rare, and he needed specific tissue markers. I asked why she was telling me this. She said because she knew my blood type was B negative too, same as my biological father's, that we might be a match. I felt sick. The universe couldn't be this cruel. I told my mother I wasn't getting tested, that Richard could rot for all I cared. She nodded and said she understood, that she'd support whatever I decided. But I could see in her eyes she was struggling with it too, despite everything he'd done. A week later, my mother called again. She'd spoken with Richard's doctors. His condition was deteriorating faster than expected. He had maybe 3 months without a transplant. She said she'd visited him in the hospital, not out of love or forgiveness, but because she needed to see him to make her own peace with whatever happened. She said he was a shell of the man she'd married, jaundiced and weak, barely able to speak. She said he'd asked about me, wanted to know if I'd consider getting tested. I asked what she'd told him. She said she told him the truth, that he'd destroyed any relationship we'd had, that he had no right to ask me for anything. But she said seeing him dying had made her think about forgiveness and second chances. I told her there was a difference between forgiving someone and giving them part of your liver. She agreed, but said she wanted me to think about it, not for Richard, but for myself. So I wouldn't wonder years later if I'd made the right choice. I said I'd think about it, but I knew I wouldn't change my mind. Richard didn't deserve my help. 2 weeks after that conversation, I got a letter. It was from Richard, handwritten in shaky cursive. He apologized for everything he'd done, said he'd been greedy and desperate and had made terrible choices. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness. But he asked if I'd consider getting tested, not because he had any right to ask, but because he wanted to live long enough to make some kind of amends for the harm he'd caused. He said he'd been sober for 18 months, was in therapy, was trying to become a better person even though it was too late to fix what he'd broken. The letter was pathetic and manipulative and probably sincere all at once. I threw it away, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I talked to my therapist, a woman named Dr. Rachel Kim, who'd been helping me process the trauma from the ICE investigation. She asked me what I wanted to do, not what I thought I should do. I said I wanted Richard to suffer the way he'd made me suffer. She asked if watching him die would actually give me that satisfaction. I didn't have an answer. She said I should think about what decision would let me move forward without regret, whether that meant donating or not. I spent 3 weeks wrestling with it. I talked to Margaret, my immigration attorney, who said donating a liver to someone who'd committed crimes against me was not legally required and potentially psychologically harmful. I talked to Kevin, the PI who'd investigated Richard, who said the guy was a scumbag and I shouldn't feel guilty about letting nature take its course. I talked to my mother, who said she'd love me no matter what I decided, but thought I should at least get tested to know if it was even an option before torturing myself over the decision. That logic made sense, so I agreed to get tested. The testing took a week: blood work, imaging, psychological evaluation. The results came back. I was a perfect match. 6-point tissue compatibility, same blood type, healthy liver, no contraindications. If I donated, Richard's chances of survival were over 90%. Without a transplant, he'd be dead in 6 weeks. Dr. Vega called to give me the results and ask if I wanted to proceed. I said I needed time to think. I called a meeting with everyone who mattered: my mother, Margaret, Dr. Kim. I laid out the situation. I was a perfect match. Richard would die without me, but he'd also tried to destroy my life. What was the right thing to do? Margaret said legally I had no obligation and that organ donation was always voluntary. Dr. Kim said the question wasn't what was right in some objective sense, but what I could live with. My mother said she'd made peace with whatever I decided, but she thought saving a life, even Richard's, might give me closure that revenge never could. I asked her if she really believed that. She said she didn't know, but that she'd been thinking about my grandmother's inheritance, about how she'd given me that money to build a good life, not to carry hate. That maybe the best revenge was showing Richard I was better than him, that I could give him life when he'd tried to destroy mine. I thought about that for a long time. Then I made my decision. I called Dr. Vega and told her I'd do it. Not for Richard, not even for my mother, but for myself, so I'd never wonder if I'd been as cruel as he was. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Richard was too weak to tolerate it sooner, needed to be stabilized first. During those 3 weeks, I second-guessed myself daily. Woke up angry that I'd agreed. But I didn't back out. The day before surgery, Richard's lawyer called. He wanted me to know Richard had made a new will and was leaving me $25,000 as thanks. I told the lawyer to tell Richard to keep his money, that I wasn't doing this for payment. I was doing it so I could move on with my life. The surgery happened on a Thursday morning at 7 a.m. They took 60% of my liver, enough to save Richard while leaving me with enough to regenerate. The recovery was brutal. 6 weeks of pain, of walking bent over, of barely being able to eat. My mother took care of me, and I had plenty of time to think about my choices. 3 months post-surgery, I got a call from Detective Wright, the PI. He said he'd been investigating something else and had discovered that Richard's liver failure wasn't just bad luck. Medical records he'd obtained showed Richard had been drinking heavily in prison and after release, despite knowing he had hepatitis C from an old blood transfusion. He'd essentially caused his own liver failure through deliberate self-destruction. Wright said he thought I should know that Richard's crisis was self-inflicted, not random bad luck. The information didn't change what I'd done, but it added another layer to the betrayal. Richard had destroyed his liver through his own choices and then asked me to fix it. A year after the transplant, Richard wrote me another letter. He was healthy, back to working part-time as a bookkeeper since he couldn't get his financial planning license back. He said the transplant had given him a second chance and he was trying to use it better. He said he'd been attending AA meetings and therapy, was trying to understand why he'd been so cruel. He said he knew I'd never forgive him and didn't expect to have a relationship, but he wanted me to know he was grateful. I didn't respond to the letter, but I didn't throw it away either. 2 years post-transplant, my mother told me Richard had reached out asking if he could pay for my medical expenses from the donation. I'd had insurance, but there were copays and lost work that had cost me about $8,000 total. I told her to tell Richard yes, he could pay that back. He sent a check for $10,000 with a note saying the extra was for the pain and suffering. I cashed it and donated $9,000 to an immigrant rights organization that helped people fight false immigration reports. Kept $1,000 for myself. 3 years after the transplant, I ran into Richard at a grocery store. We both froze. He looked healthy, had gained weight, his skin was normal color. He said hello. I said hello. He asked if I was doing well. I said yes. He said he was glad, that he thought about what I'd done for him every day. I said I'd done it for myself, not for him. He nodded and said he understood that, but it had saved him anyway. We parted awkwardly. I told my mother about it later, and she said Richard had been asking about me occasionally, wanted to know if I was happy, if I'd gotten married, if my career was going well. I'd made junior partner at my firm, had bought a condo with my inheritance money, was dating someone kind. My life was good despite Richard, not because of him. 5 years after the transplant, my mother called and said Richard wanted to meet with both of us. He had something to say. I almost refused, but my mother said she'd be there and we could leave anytime. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. Richard looked older but steady. He said he wanted to make a formal apology, not to ease his conscience, but because we deserved to hear it. He said filing the false ICE report was the worst thing he'd ever done, that he'd been consumed by greed and had justified it by telling himself I was arrogant for not accepting his help. He said prison had given him time to understand he'd been the arrogant one, that he'd felt entitled to control my money because I was young and he thought he knew better. He said therapy had helped him see he'd been threatened by my independence, by the fact that I didn't need him. He said watching me donate part of my liver after everything he'd done had broken something in him, had shown him what real character looked like. He said he'd never be able to make up for what he'd done, but he wanted us to know he was trying to live better. My mother cried. I didn't. I told Richard I appreciated the apology, but that it didn't change the past. He nodded and said he knew that. He said he just wanted us to know he understood the magnitude of his betrayal and was working to be someone different. We left after that. My mother asked if I felt closure. I said I felt something, but I wasn't sure it was closure. Maybe just acknowledgement that some betrayals are too deep to fully heal. 7 years post-transplant, Richard died of a heart attack. He was 68. My mother called to tell me, asked if I wanted to go to the funeral. I said no. She went and told me afterward that it was small, just a few former colleagues and distant relatives. She said the priest mentioned Richard's second chance at life and how he'd tried to use it well. She said she'd felt sad but not grief, more like the end of a chapter. I asked if she regretted any of it. She said she regretted marrying him but not divorcing him. I asked if she thought I'd done the right thing by donating. She said she thought I'd done what I needed to do for my own peace, and that was all that mattered. I thought about that a lot after his death. Had I done it for peace? Or had I done it to prove I was better than him? Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter. I'd given him 7 more years of life after he'd tried to destroy mine. That was enough. The inheritance from my grandmother, the money Richard had tried to steal, had grown over the years. I'd invested it wisely, watched it appreciate, used part of it for my condo and part of it for my future. It was worth over $300,000 now. Sometimes I thought about how Richard had tried to take that from me and had ended up with nothing. How he'd filed a false report to control me and ended up in prison. How he'd destroyed his liver and needed mine to survive. The poetic justice wasn't lost on me. He'd tried to take everything and ended up needing the person he'd betrayed most. And I'd given it to him, not out of forgiveness, but out of a desire to be free of him. That was my closure. I'm 31 now. My mother is 62 and thriving, running her own bookkeeping business and dating someone who treats her well. I'm engaged to someone who knows the whole story and loves me anyway. I still have nightmares sometimes about ICE agents at my door, but they're less frequent. The liver donation left a scar across my abdomen, a physical reminder of the whole mess. Sometimes I trace it and think about how bodies heal but memories don't, not completely. Richard tried to destroy me for money and ended up surviving only because I chose mercy over revenge. He lived 7 more years he wouldn't have had without me, and I live with the knowledge that I was capable of saving someone who'd tried to ruin me. I don't know if that makes me strong or stupid, maybe both. My therapist says it makes me human, capable of both anger and compassion, capable of holding contradictions. I think that's probably right. The story doesn't have a clean ending because life doesn't work that way. Richard's dead now, and I'm alive and successful and happy. The inheritance he tried to steal paid for my life. The liver I gave him bought his final years. We're even in the cruelest way possible, and that's the only justice I was ever going to get. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it.